In the months leading up to the Normandy invasion, American planners studied the German defenses along the French coast with a mixture of awe and dread. The Atlantic Wall was not a single line of fortifications. It was a network of obstacles designed to trap, choke, and slaughter any army attempting to land on its beaches. Engineers examining reconnaissance photos saw more than concrete bunkers and machine gun nests. They saw an entire coastline shaped into a weapon. Rows of anti-tank hedgehogs, timber stakes angled toward the surf, tangled metal ramps meant to flip landing craft, trenches deep enough to swallow tanks, craters where Luftwaffe bombs had torn the sand, collapsed seawalls, scattered wreckage from storms. And behind all of it, narrow routes up steep bluffs that were certain to become death traps once the Germans opened fire. American commanders knew that infantry could storm the beaches, tanks could provide firepower, and naval guns could pound the cliffs. But none of these forces could move inland if the beach itself remained a maze of debris and destruction. The first waves would simply pile up against obstacles and die under the guns of the defenders. What the Allies needed was not just courage, they needed mobility. They needed a way to absorb chaos and turn it into order. They needed a tool that could make a path where no path existed, and that tool, they realized, was the bulldozer. It was an unlikely weapon. A bulldozer did not fire shells or bullets. It did not move quickly. It had no armor beyond what engineers welded onto it in field workshops. Yet it possessed something more essential than firepower. It had the strength to reshape the battlefield. With its steel blade, it could fill bomb craters, push aside wreckage, clear lanes through barbed wire, uproot obstacles, and carve ramps up sand embankments. In a landscape designed to trap Americans on the beach, the bulldozer was the one machine that could build an escape route in real time under fire. Planners in both the Army and the Navy understood this long before June 6th. Early briefings warned that if bulldozers did not make it ashore quickly, the first waves could become isolated and pinned down. A single disabled landing craft or destroyed Sherman could block an entire regiment from moving off the sand. The risk was so high that engineers proposed something unprecedented. Bulldozers would land not hours after the infantry, but with them, alongside them, and in some cases before them. These machines would go ashore in the very first waves, entering the same kill zones as riflemen and combat medics. The decision shocked many officers. Sending unarmored or lightly armored dozers straight into the teeth of the Atlantic Wall seemed suicidal. But the logic was brutal and undeniable. Without them, the landings could not succeed. The beaches at Normandy were too narrow and too exposed for infantry to advance if the terrain remained broken. The bluffs were too steep to climb without cleared paths. The bomb craters were too deep to cross without being filled, and the wreckage from destroyed boats and vehicles would only grow until it formed an impenetrable wall between the sea and the land. Only bulldozers could fix that. The engineers chosen for this mission trained with an understanding that few in the Army shared. They knew their role was not support, it was survival. They were the ones who would decide whether the landing force lived long enough to reach the bluffs. They practiced driving dozers through mud, over sand, across barbed wire, and around obstacles arranged to mimic German defenses. They learned how to maneuver with minimal visibility, how to operate through smoke and debris, and how to push aside wreckage without stopping the engine. They studied beach gradients, soil density, and wave patterns. And they trained not in quiet engineering grounds, but on firing ranges where machine guns rattled overhead to simulate the chaos they would face on D-Day. Meanwhile, photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft reinforced the urgency of their task. At Omaha Beach, the terrain offered almost no natural exits. Only narrow draws led inland, each of them heavily fortified with concrete bunkers and overlapping fields of fire. The Navy and Air Force would bombard these positions, but no one believed bombardment alone would clear the way. Bulldozer crews were expected to force openings through wreckage and collapse points, enabling infantry and tanks to move quickly before German reinforcements could reach the beach. At Utah Beach, the problem was different, but just as deadly. The beach itself sloped gently, but the approaches were riddled with obstacles and anti-tank traps hidden beneath the sand. Bulldozers would have to land early, clear a path before the tide buried the obstacles, and build ramps for vehicles to cross the seawall. Without this work, the landing would bottleneck, trapping thousands in the open. Commanders repeatedly told bulldozer crews that they were not just clearing paths, they were preventing deaths. They were saving companies before the companies ever came under fire. One general bluntly said, "A bulldozer blade is worth more than a battalion of riflemen if it can keep the beach from turning into a slaughter field." On the final day of planning, as bulldozer crews loaded their machines onto LCTs and LCMs, many realized the weight of their assignment. They were not going ashore to build roads after the battle. They were going ashore to survive the opening minutes of the largest amphibious invasion in history. They were going ashore with no cover but smoke and chaos. They were going ashore knowing their machines were slow, large, and impossible to hide. Yet every engineer understood why they were going. If they did not open the beach, no one else would. Part 1 ends with a bulldozer crew standing on the deck of their landing craft, watching the gray dawn rise over the channel. Their machine waits behind them, chains rattling, engine ready. Ahead lies the French coast, hidden behind mist and fire. They do not know if they will survive. They only know that tens of thousands of soldiers behind them will depend on what they do in the first minutes after landing. And as the landing craft begins its slow approach to the shore, they grip the rails and prepare to drive steel into hell itself. When the landing craft finally surged toward the Normandy coast on the morning of June 6, 1944, the ocean was already a graveyard of smoke, shattered obstacles, and broken boats. The naval bombardment had shaken the cliffs, but it had not silenced them. German machine guns were alive, angry, and ready. Mortars fell like hail. The air vibrated with the whip crack of MG-42 bursts. Men crouched behind the steel ramps of their LCVPs, praying they would live long enough to reach the sand. But among them were soldiers who feared something else entirely. They feared the moment the ramp dropped, and they had to start an engine instead of running for cover. They were the bulldozer crews of the first wave, the men who would bring steel into the open while everyone else tried to survive. As the landing craft closed the distance to Omaha Beach, the coxswain shouted over the roar of gunfire to prepare to drop the ramp. Infantrymen gripped their rifles tighter. Engineers clutched their tools. And behind them, the hulking shape of a bulldozer shuddered with every splash of the waves. The driver sat perched high, fully exposed above the blade, knowing that once he started forward, every German on the bluff would see him instantly. The dozer could not zigzag, it could not sprint, it could only move straight. And yet the mission demanded that he drive without hesitation. The ramp dropped. Chaos exploded. Machine gun bursts shredded the water. Men leapt over the sides or sprinted forward only to fall within seconds. But amid the chaos, the bulldozer's engine roared to life. The blade dipped. The tracks bit into sand, and the machine lunged forward like some stubborn beast refusing to die. The Germans reacted immediately. Every gun that could swing toward the beach pivoted toward the dozer. Sparks burst across the blade as bullets ricocheted off hardened steel. The driver hunkered low, gripping the controls as if holding on to the last solid thing in the world. Infantrymen, stunned by the sight, instinctively ducked behind the bulldozer, turning its blade into a rolling shield. The dozer became a moving wall of salvation. One soldier later wrote that the sound of bullets pinging off the blade was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. He stayed so close behind it that if the driver had stopped suddenly, he would have crashed directly into the blade. But the dozer did not stop. It pushed toward a bomb crater the size of a swimming pool. The crater blocked the entire approach route. Landing craft were piling up behind it, helpless under fire. If the crater was not filled, every boat landing in that lane would become a coffin. The driver pushed the throttle and angled the blade downward.
Sand, rocks, and wreckage poured into the crater. All the while, bullets slammed against the steel and mortar bursts erupted around the tracks. When the hole was finally filled enough for a jeep or half-track to pass, the driver did not celebrate. He simply turned toward the next obstacle and kept moving. At Utah Beach, bulldozer crews faced a different kind of hell. The landing force drifted south of their planned zone, landing near an area filled with anti-tank traps and stakes buried beneath sand. The engineers recognized immediately that vehicles would never get inland unless paths were cleared. And so, with German fire cracking across the water, they drove their dozers directly off the ramps and onto sand so churned by explosions that it felt like thick mud. The stakes tore at their blades, shrapnel clanged off their engines. Entire landing craft shifted sideways in the surf, threatening to spill tanks into deep water. But the dozers pressed forward, carving lanes through the obstacles, while infantry pressed close behind. One driver at Utah described the moment his dozer became the center of a desperate fight. German machine gunners had zeroed in on his lane, pinning down an entire platoon. The bulldozer, already hit multiple times, scraped forward until its blade formed a slope up the side of the seawall. The infantry used the slope as a ramp, climbing over it and pouring fire down onto the German positions. The driver kept the engine running the entire time, refusing to abandon his machine even when smoke and dust blinded him. What he created in that moment was not just a path, it was a lifeline. As more waves landed behind them, bulldozers multiplied their impact. They pushed burning wreckage aside to open driving lanes. They cleared obstacles so medics could reach wounded men. They dragged disabled vehicles out of the way so the next wave would not collide with them. One dozer crew at Omaha famously dragged the shattered hull of a landing craft off the beach while under direct fire. The act opened a corridor that allowed an entire battalion to move forward. Later, an officer wrote of that moment, "Those dozers saved an entire battalion. They were angels made of steel." No part of what they did was glamorous. There were no heroic charges or dramatic firefights. Their bravery was measured in forward motion under fire, in the grinding of tracks, in the slow and unstoppable push of steel against sand and rubble. Yet every minute their engines ran, lives were saved. Hundreds of soldiers found cover behind their blades. Hundreds more reached the seawall because dozers had filled the holes, crushed the obstacles, and made the beach crossable. Part 2 ends with one final image. A bulldozer sits at the base of Omaha's bluffs, its engine smoking, its blade dented and scorched. Around it, infantry scramble up a path that did not exist minutes before. The driver wipes blood and sweat from his face, looks back toward the water, and sees the next wave approaching. He restarts the engine. The work is not finished. The beach must be opened, and only he can do it. The chaos on Omaha and Utah did not end once the first dozers carved their initial paths. In many sectors, the beaches remained killing grounds long after the first wave had landed. Bodies, burning vehicles, capsized landing craft, and shattered steel obstacles created a maze of death that trapped entire American companies in pockets of fire, with no way forward and no way back. German gunners positioned high in concrete bunkers overlooking the surf poured relentless fire onto these men. Machine guns swept the sand, mortars crashed down with terrifying accuracy. Every attempt to move resulted in more casualties. It was in these moments, when infantry felt completely abandoned by fate and pinned beneath an impossible storm of bullets, that bulldozers became something more than machines. They became the only hope left. The survivors on the beach would later say the transformation happened in seconds. One moment, they were pinned behind a half-submerged landing craft, unable to move a meter without drawing fire. The next moment, they heard the unmistakable roar of a diesel engine behind them. Through smoke and sand, the silhouette of a bulldozer appeared, crawling slowly toward them like a steel beast rising out of the surf. The blade caught the morning light, scarred and pitted from earlier impacts, but still intact. And behind that blade, crouching low with rifles ready, came an entire line of infantrymen who had been waiting for a chance to break free.
The bulldozer driver did not hesitate. He angled the blade forward, lowered it to the sand, and drove straight into the wall of obstacles that had held the men captive. German bullets ricocheted in sparks across the blade. Mortar shells erupted around the tracks. Sand and debris rained down from the explosions. Yet the dozer continued forward. Inch by inch, it pushed aside twisted metal, shattered timber, and the wreckage of boats that had sunk before reaching the shore. What had been a pile of death became a path, rough and narrow, but usable. The infantry surged behind it. In the Fox Green sector of Omaha, one company had been pinned down for nearly an hour when a bulldozer gave them their only chance at survival. The men were trapped between mortar fire and a tangle of obstacles that prevented them from reaching the seawall. Every attempt to crawl forward resulted in casualties. The officers knew they would be wiped out completely if something did not change. Then a bulldozer appeared, its driver sitting high behind a plate of improvised armor welded onto the cab. The Germans concentrated their fire immediately, sending hundreds of rounds into the metal shell. But the driver pushed forward, clearing enough debris for the company to crawl behind the machine and reach the relative safety of the seawall. The company commander later wrote, "We lived because one man in a bulldozer refused to stop. I do not know his name, I only know he saved all of us." In another sector, a dozer crew faced a situation that would become one of the most dramatic rescues of the entire invasion. A battalion had become trapped behind the hulk of a destroyed landing craft that had twisted sideways in the tide, blocking the only path through a narrow gap in the beach obstacles. The men lay pinned behind it, unable to move, while German fire tore into them from elevated bunkers. If they remained trapped, they would be annihilated. A bulldozer crew volunteered to clear the hull despite knowing it would draw the full attention of the German defenses. The dozer moved forward into the kill zone. Mortar rounds exploded so close that the machine rocked on its treads. MG-42 fire slapped against the blade so violently that sparks flew like a shower of metal rain. But the driver pushed the machine against the broken hull, tilted the blade, and pushed. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the warped steel of the wrecked boat shifted. The path widened. Trapped soldiers began to scramble through the opening, crawling over the sand as bullets hissed overhead. The battalion passed through the escape corridor one thin file at a time, men sprinting from one side of the beach to the other behind the bulldozer's shield. The dozer's engine screamed under the strain, but it held. So did the driver. When the last soldier passed, the dozer backed away, the blade smoking from hits. The officer who witnessed it later wrote the now famous line, "Those dozers saved an entire battalion. They were angels made of steel." The dozers did far more than rescue trapped troops. They created entirely new routes where German defenses assumed none could exist. One dozer carved a ramp up the side of a bomb crater, turning a deadly pit into a usable slope that allowed tanks to pass. Another filled a trench so deep that engineers had judged it impassable until the dozer arrived. Some dozers cleared paths for medics, pushing aside debris so stretchers could reach wounded men who would have otherwise bled out on the sand. In Utah Beach's chaos, a bulldozer crew performed what infantrymen later called a miracle. A platoon was trapped behind a cluster of anti-tank stakes covered by machine gun fire. The men could not move without being cut down. The dozer, already hit multiple times, crawled forward until its blade was directly between the platoon and the German guns. The crew dropped the blade to create a steel wall. The infantry used the wall as cover, advancing step by step, firing from behind the moving shield. It was not elegant, it was not planned, but it worked. The platoon reached the seawall with no additional casualties. These scenes repeated themselves along both Omaha and Utah. Each time, the story was the same. A dozer moved when no one else could. A blade pushed aside what had trapped ordinary soldiers. A machine built to move earth instead moved men towards survival. And each time the driver sat exposed, gripping controls slick with sweat, forcing himself to push forward even as German fire hammered into the metal around him. Part 3 ends with the image of a dozer idling at the base of a newly cleared path, its blade still hot, its engine rattling, its driver slumped forward in exhaustion. Behind him, a company of men emerges from smoke and debris, alive only because he carved a way out of hell. They look at the machine as if it is something beyond steel, something that defied the battlefield itself. And as the dozer turns toward the next obstacle, the men follow, because they now understand the truth every survivor of Normandy learned that day. Sometimes, salvation on a battlefield does not come from a rifle or a medic. Sometimes, it comes from the unstoppable push of a bulldozer.
Normandy was only the beginning. After the beaches were secured and the lines pushed inland, the American army discovered a truth that would follow it through every village, forest, and battlefield in Western Europe. Bulldozers were not simply machines for the landings. They were the backbone of mobility for the entire campaign. Wherever the front moved, bulldozers followed, shaping and reshaping the battlefield in ways no rifleman or tanker could. They cleared roads, carved supply routes, built tank trails, pulled wrecks from choke points, and turned ruined terrain into corridors of movement. If the infantry were the flesh of the advance, and the armored divisions the fists, then the bulldozers were the arteries that kept everything flowing. After breaking out of Normandy, the Americans faced a landscape utterly destroyed by war. Towns were reduced to rubble heaps, roads were cratered by bombs or blocked by collapsed buildings. Bridges had been demolished by retreating German units. Forest paths were buried beneath fallen trees from artillery barrages. French fields, soaked with weeks of rain, had turned into mud so thick even Sherman tanks bogged down. For every mile gained, the terrain became another battlefield that had to be conquered. And it was the bulldozers that conquered it. Outside Saint-Lô, the ground was so churned by explosions that entire companies struggled to move 20 meters without sinking to their knees in mud or tripping over shattered stone. Bulldozers became the only machines capable of pushing through the devastation. With their steel blades, they carved new paths alongside destroyed roads, leveling ground so trucks and tank destroyers could pass. Engineers remembered the way infantry officers would stand at the edge of a ruined street, point to a pile of debris higher than a man, and simply say, "Make us a road." And the bulldozers did. Sherman tanks relied heavily on bulldozers during this period. A tank could crush small obstacles, but not collapsed buildings or deep craters. A tank could not pull another tank from a ditch without risking immobilization, but a bulldozer could. In one engagement near Marigny, 2 tanks had become stuck in a shell crater while trying to flank a German position. The enemy fire pinned them down, and escape seemed impossible. A bulldozer, its blade raised, drove straight across open ground under fire, dropped the blade behind the crater, and pushed both tanks free. The tankers later joked that the dozer had the armor of a battleship and the stubbornness of a mule. The truth was simpler. It did what nothing else could. As the Americans pushed toward the German border, the destruction only intensified. In the Hürtgen forest, the terrain became a nightmare of mud, shattered trees, and hidden ravines. Bulldozers cut paths for infantry and vehicles alike, pushing aside trees that had been blasted into tangled walls. When roads collapsed under the weight of rain and artillery, bulldozers rebuilt them by shoving fallen logs into the gaps and layering them with earth. When tanks or trucks slid off the narrow forest trails, bulldozers dragged them back with the same steady determination they had shown on Omaha. Their blades became battering rams. Their engines became the pulse of movement. The work was exhausting. Bulldozer crews often operated for 20 hours at a time. Smoke from their engines mixed with the smoke of burning forests. Artillery shells slammed into the trees above them, showering them with splinters and fragments. Yet they continued because the entire advance depended on them. When infantrymen saw a bulldozer approaching through the trees, its headlights dimmed, its tracks grinding through mud, they felt something like relief. It meant they would not be stuck in that miserable forest forever. It meant they could keep moving. In the Battle of the Bulge, bulldozers became lifesavers once again. The Ardennes forest, blanketed in deep snow and ice, became a frozen labyrinth where nothing moved easily. Roads vanished beneath snowdrifts. Vehicles slid into ditches. Supply trucks were trapped behind fallen trees that German forces had deliberately knocked down to block the routes. Bulldozers went to work in temperatures that froze exposed skin. Their engines groaned in the cold, their blades scraped against ice so hard it sparked. Yet they carved open the narrow roads that allowed American reinforcements to reach Bastogne. They pulled trucks free from snowbanks. They cleared firing positions for artillery crews. They opened supply routes that determined whether surrounded units lived or died. One engineer recalled that during the Bulge, the bulldozer became the most important vehicle in the entire theater. Tanks were useless without roads, trucks were useless without clear lanes, artillery was useless without places to emplace their guns. A bulldozer, however, made all of those things possible. The soldier wrote, "A dozer could turn a snowed-in trail into a highway. It could turn a collapsed road into a lifeline. It could turn a forest into a path. Sometimes, that was all we needed to survive." The German soldiers who captured American positions during brief counterattacks were shocked by what they found. In towns like Foy, Neuville, and Clairvaux, they discovered entire streets that had been cleared by dozers only hours earlier. In after-action reports, German officers grudgingly acknowledged the Americans were able to move with astonishing speed because of the machines the engineers used. One German report called them the silent artillery of the American advance, because they reshaped terrain faster than German forces could tear it down. By the time the Americans crossed into Germany, bulldozers had become so essential that High Command ordered more than twice the expected number for the final phase of the war. When bridges were blown, bulldozers carved bypasses through riverbanks. When towns were destroyed, bulldozers cleared rubble for convoys. When German resistance stiffened and artillery cratered the roads behind the front, bulldozers repaired them so supply trucks could keep up. Without them, the American advance would have stalled in France. With them, it punched through France, Belgium, and into the heart of Germany. Part 4 ends with a simple but powerful image. A bulldozer stands at the edge of a ruined German town, its blade coated in dust and soot. Behind it stretches a newly cleared road where moments earlier there had only been rubble. A column of tanks rolls forward. A line of ambulances follows. Supply trucks rumble past. The war moves on not because it is easy, but because a machine built to move Earth has made a path where none existed. For every mile gained, a bulldozer walked it first, turning destruction into possibility and chaos into progress.
When the war finally ended and the guns fell silent across Europe, armies everywhere counted their dead, honored their heroes, and recorded their histories. Infantry regiments recited the names of men who had stormed machine gun nests. Tank crews spoke of duels fought at point-blank range. Medics told stories of dragging the wounded out of fire. But among all these voices, one group remained strangely quiet: the bulldozer crews. They did not appear in newsreels as often as bomber pilots. They did not earn the fame of paratroopers or armored divisions. Yet when commanders reviewed the numbers of men who had survived battles that should have been massacres, when they examined the paths carved through destroyed towns and shattered forests, when they retraced the courses of rescues that had saved entire units, they realized something extraordinary. The bulldozer crews had saved more lives than almost anyone understood. Engineers were never supposed to be heroes. Their job, on paper, was simple: move Earth, clear debris, shape terrain. But in the reality of war, especially in a war as chaotic as the fight across Europe, those humble tasks became acts of courage. Every time a bulldozer blade pushed into a mine-filled road, the driver risked being blown apart. Every time he cleared wreckage under machine gun fire, he became the most obvious target on the battlefield. Every time he drove into a town under shelling to pull a burning tank out of the street, he traded his safety for the survival of the crews inside it. The statistics told the story after the fact. In Normandy alone, bulldozers cleared more than 1,000 obstacles that would have stalled entire regiments. During the breakout from Saint-Lô, bulldozers opened routes that allowed armored divisions to move so quickly that German units were overwhelmed before they could redeploy. In the Ardennes, bulldozers cut more than 200 miles of emergency winter roads to supply surrounded units. And across Germany, they cleared town after town, enabling medical teams to reach the wounded within minutes instead of hours. No commander could quantify exactly how many lives were saved. The number was simply described in official reports as countless. What made their work even more remarkable was the mindset of the men themselves. Bulldozer crews rarely saw themselves as heroes. They viewed what they did as duty. They talked about engines, tracks, blades, broken housings, and hydraulic leaks far more than they talked about courage. Yet the soldiers who survived because of them never forgot. In letters home, infantrymen wrote about bulldozers appearing through smoke like guardian spirits. Medics described bulldozers arriving just in time to clear a path to a casualty who would have died without immediate care. Tank crews recalled moments when a dozer dragged their burning tank out of the line of fire seconds before the ammunition cooked off. Generals noticed it too. After the war, one senior officer summarized the impact with a simple truth. Without bulldozers, we would still be sitting on the beaches of Normandy. It was not the tanks, the artillery, or even the air power that first made the invasion possible. It was a blade of steel pushed by a man who refused to stop. Another officer wrote that bulldozer crews saved more soldiers than any single medical battalion because they prevented entire companies from being trapped and slaughtered. In interviews conducted decades after the war, German veterans spoke with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. They had expected American armor and air power. They had expected superior logistics, but they did not expect bulldozers to turn battlefield destruction into new roads almost instantly. One German soldier remembered watching a bulldozer push through a street that his unit had intentionally collapsed with explosives. "We thought they would take them a day," he said. "It took them an hour." Another recalled that every time they blew down trees or cratered roads to slow American tanks, bulldozers arrived before the smoke cleared. The enduring legacy of the bulldozer crews was not carved in medals or monuments, but in memory. Among the infantry, they became legends. Men told stories of the Steel Angels, who saved them at Omaha. In armored units, they became good luck symbols. Whenever a bulldozer arrived at the front, tank crews cheered because it meant they would not be stranded or surrounded. In medical companies, bulldozers were regarded as extensions of their own hands, clearing the way to save the wounded. But perhaps the most powerful testament came from a simple photograph taken near the end of the war. In the image, a lone bulldozer stands in the middle of a destroyed German village. Its blade is coated in dust. Its driver leans against the engine housing, exhausted, his uniform dark with sweat and oil. Behind him, a column of infantry walks past along a road he carved minutes earlier. None of them look back. They are focused on the fight ahead. The bulldozer driver watches them go, wipes the grime from his face, climbs back into the operator's seat, and prepares to clear the next obstacle. It is a snapshot of the war as only bulldozer crews understood it. Endless work, endless danger, endless lives saved. Part 5 ends with this quiet but powerful truth. In a war defined by tanks, bombers, and battleships, the machine that saved the most lives on land was a bulldozer. And the men who drove them were not just engineers. They were the guardians of every soldier trapped by obstacles, the rescuers of every company pinned by fire, and the silent architects of every American advance. They were, as one survivor wrote, not angels with wings, but angels made of steel. And we lived because they kept moving forward
when no one else could.